my comrade in arms, Johan Linåker.
Senior researcher at Rice and assistant professor at Lund University.
So, like I said, Johan and I just gave a presentation which focused on one part of our research agenda, which is about open source adoption in the public sector. And we presented a study there which looked at how public sector driven open source is developed and maybe how it differs from private sector open source projects. But we also touched there on this notion of public sector adoption of open source, which I think is something that I have given many presentations on, and I think I always have to think about, okay, what's the audience here? Why am I talking about these issues at the Linux Foundation Europe Summit? And so the challenge for us as researchers is really about this: how do we make sure that we do research that ultimately can be presented to different audiences and inform action. So often I talk to public sector officials and politicians, and I want to get them to take some sort of action. Here I'm talking to the open source community, and it's like, okay, what kind of action do I want the open source community to take? So this thinking a little bit out loud here, and how I'm going to relay the research that we're doing into sort of actionable something. And so a few years ago, I did together with, I was part of a team that delivered a study for the European Commission, and Paula was also part of that study team, and I mentioned Paula also in my last presentation. So, but if you're in the audience, you have to be ready to be called out. And so basically, this talked about the value of open source to the European economy and to European society. And I think this morning, Jim also mentioned the work by Frank Nagel, because we came to a figure around 75 billion euros or something like that. Now they're talking about 8 trillion. The point is that, open source contributes to the economy, and that's kind of not being contested. I think the research that Johan and I are doing, and that also the Linux Foundation has done and others, is that the public sector presents like a real opportunity and in a way a missed opportunity, notwithstanding some really positive developments in the public sector. But there's been for many years a sense that the real opportunity for open source is in the public sector. And so how do we tap into that? And I just also, because we're at the LF, I wanted to show a slide. There was a report came up from LF Research also, which looked at this. What's the opportunity, and what are some of the blockers still? So this I also you can also check out. Now, so the public sector is missing out. That's basically what the message is. At the same time, the public sector now, or governments across the world, has actually entered into an obligation to actually do something. So we have, late last year, during the UN General Assembly, world leaders agreed on, path to the future, including a global digital compact. And in the text that was adopted by all the member states of the UN, there is basically a commitment to, by 2030, not only develop open source solutions, but also to promote best practice and to increase funding, not only in Europe but in across the world, and to fund efforts so that the global south also benefits. And the final point there is also about encouraging partnerships. And I think this is the third panel I'm on at the LF event, where we are talking about sort of this last point, really, which is about, there's an obligation for governments to do something, but there's also an obligation from, to engage in these partnerships, and that's also that includes the open source community. So what we're saying is that there's research showing that there's a lot of value to be had. There's research showing that there's a missed opportunity and at the same time an obligation. And so that brings me to what we are proposing today, which is a collaboration between at the moment between the UN ODET and the UN University in Macau and RISE, which is where Johan and I work. And I don't know, Johan, do you want to say something about this at this point?
Yeah, maybe we can just say a few words. So the idea is really, so what we've seen in our research and looking at the compact is that there is an obligation and a need to share best practice. And there's a lot of good efforts, there's a lot of good resources, a lot of good front runners, but what we're missing is some kind of flag showing the way, showing the direction, enabling follow-up, enabling comparison between national governments, showing, okay, what others are doing in a more systematic way. Again, we do reports, we've done reports, others are doing reports, all great, but these things tend to like trickle down in the digital addict, and there is a need for something that can help drive the maturity. And we have a lot of these digital government indices. The OECD has some, the UN has some, several not to mention, but open source is rarely mentioned anywhere. The focus is typically on open data, open government data, open standards to some sense, but open source software, and then we can talk about open hardware. But as we're talking about digital sovereignty, interoperability, and so on, we need to consider not just the data, we need to consider the technology aspects as well. This is not reflected in these indices. So this is basically the void that we're trying to address with this compass.
Right, so indeed, we have found in our research that these, and I think that's not a new finding, but that governments are motivated a lot by these global rankings and to take policy action. And we found very few open source indicators in these global rankings. And we thought that given the evidence of the contribution from open source to digital transformation, that was a kind of a surprising finding, I think. And just to kind of say that this project that we are proposing, we understand that this is just one piece of the puzzle, and it's linked to, and I think I often talk about this, for open source adoption to happen, you have to have both bottom up, top down, and probably like buy-in from the middle as well. There are many components needed, and this notion of having a global ranking or some kind of index to measure global open source adoption, it's mainly focused on the political level to ensure that there is a sort of a sustained political interest in pursuing some of these policies, because we know that governments are motivated by that. We, of course, understand that there's a risk, and I think this has come out as well a lot in the research, that there is a tendency sometimes for governments to study for the exam kind of thing, where they'll say, oh, to be the most innovative economy in the world, we have to have X, Y, Z, and so then they'll say, we have adopted X, Y, Z, so that we can say that we should rank highly on this in this ranking. But so I mean, I think when we are talking about this project, it's really about understanding that we need a lot of other things in place as well, right? So,
and maybe to add, we're calling it the compass because it's about showing the direction. But seeing that Omar, who's not here, is from Morocco and loved the Atlas Mountains, it's also an atlas. It's a map. It's a map and a compass showing how you can get inspired by your front doors, by the good examples, both in emerging countries and basically globally, so you can compare and contrast. So it's not like pointing fingers or anything, it's about showing best practice and enabling follow-up and enabling direction, providing a foundation for decision makers to use when saying, okay, by 2030 we need to do something, okay, but what are we going to do? Look at this. And then tying that back to the digital compact. And I think today was more, even with or without Omar, our intentions was for this to be not just us talking to each other, but more like an interactive panel, basically a call for action. We had this set up during the UN Open Source Week as well, during the Community Day, basically just talking about this and hearing people's thoughts. I mean, so we have 3 logos up there, but ideally we would like more, both in terms of funders, knowledge partners, whoever wants to contribute to this work. Everyone has a lot of different perspectives, both from city level to state agencies, to national governments, to transnationals, non-profits. Everyone has different perspectives, and all of them are necessary to consider. So consider this panel more as a call to action and basically like a first opportunity to get some kind of input into this work, which is going to happen. And our idea is really to have a distributed process, a decentralized process. I know Stefan has done a lot of good work with the AI definition, so being very inclusive, and this is also something we're aiming here.
Yeah, I think, we're aiming to, every talk you give about open source is about we shouldn't reinvent the wheel and etc. So it's also about understanding what existing initiatives we could build on. And, the point is not to necessarily launch a new ranking, but actually it's interesting, James, you're in the room here. Your first week or month at Red Hat, I remember you having a conversation where you suggested that OpenForum Europe should do something about the DESI index, which is the European Commission's has an index which only, of course, covers the member states, but it's about sort of it's also about digital readiness of the public sector, etc. So, to include certain metrics around open source in there. And so I think our project is about understanding what are the correct metrics, are there already good, indicators that can be reused, and potentially launch, a standalone ranking or index, but could also be an effort to have these metrics included in other such rankings. And I think, a few years ago, that was I think there was some interesting work to have, WIPO does this innovation index, I forget what it's called, but, I think that there were some people, including people from GitHub, involved in including a measurement around open source code contributions to be included as one of the innovation indicators. So I think things like that, but just making sure that we measure the right thing and that we keep up this sort of political momentum. And also, this is something I said, I think, in my last panel as well. We have sometimes, in certain cases, declarations, regulations, statements of sort of endorsement from the high political level, but we don't always remind policymakers that they have entered into an obligation. So I want to also remind here again, I had it on the screen before, the member states have already said at some point in New York at the UN headquarters, yes, we're going to build open source solutions. We're going to share them with the global south. We're going to invest in communities. We're going to invest in security. And so, what I want to do with these sort of panels is really about sort of saying, remind people that are maybe not engaged in this kind of activity every day to be able to say, look, that, when you have a discussion with a policymaker or public sector official, but also to remind them of an obligation that their government has already entered into. And so what are they doing? And of course, what we're saying here about this is one of the ways that that governments can say that they are doing something. Responding to the obligation that they have entered into, solemnly entered into, that they are doing something. And also keeping pressure on the UN to ask the question again, back to the member states. You entered into an obligation. What are you doing about it? And so this could be part of that answer.
Maybe just as an interesting survey, a raise of hands, how many here are from the public sector or any form of government institution? 2, 3 hands only. Does this make sense?
I don't know. We work for the municipality of Amsterdam, and we're now working for the software department, but before I worked in the social domain, and there are so many legislations, like standards, things that you have to adhere to. Also in the processes, not necessarily only in the programs or like the software, that it can be really overwhelming if you're like a manager just like on the ground trying to actually help people that are homeless or like provide basic living to people that I think when they have to decide for a digital future and they say, yeah, well, we have these standards that you can also add to, they'll be like, why would I? Because I already have so many things going on for myself, or for myself, that's weird, but for my team. So that's not necessarily from the perspective where I work now for the municipality, but what I've seen more in the day-to-day operations.
I guess the idea is that open source is supposed to help with that, or like the share and reuse, for example, should help organizations to focus more on their core mission in a way. You're shaking your head, but in the previous panel, you were there maybe, no? Yeah, so I talked about this GeoTrek thing, which is the French national parks. They are stewards over a natural resource, which they could spread the word about using technology. And so to have a shared, technology where you work with other, European national parks, that makes sense. And I think that ideally that's what, I think Johan and I are trying to, it's not just about, I understand you adding something like this, and some manager comes and say, okay, what are you doing to show that you are, responding to this, or the SDGs, or, or whatever. But I mean, ideally, it should be about, especially for the public sector, where we're not talking about competition between, or even co-opetition, or whatever you want to call it, between companies. It's a different sort of, why shouldn't European public sector administrations, collaborate around these things? There is no reason. They don't even have to figure out where is the, where is the competitive layer. You're not competing, or you feel like you are competing. So
No, but no, definitely not.
I have more questions.
Just to add to that, so if you look at our municipality, the department that we are leading, software department, we are actually doing open source quite a lot. We have about 120 engineers employed, so not externally, but really employed. But why this is not really gaining momentum, or not the amount that we would like as well, is that it's much easier to just pay a commercial party, even with all the procurement steps you need to take. You discussed that as well in the previous talk, but it's simply easier, and that's the kind of fact that we're finding with as well.
Yeah. What I think we're really struggling with, because also if you look for software companies, they're very local. Like they're very ingrained into the Dutch law, into the what's it called? Well, I can't come up with the word. But like how we do social services might be very, very different from how the UK or France does it, and you need like those laws ingrained into your software.
Yes. I want to connect what you're discussing with the Cyber Resilience Act. The last session we were in, and this is also now the focus of my work, Article 16 will require manufacturers to contribute back to open source vulnerability reports or bug fixes that affect vulnerabilities. So there's going to be an obligation in the next few years to contribute back, even if you're a small local shop that's putting a product on the market to sell to a municipality. One of the most effective techniques that I saw while in US government service was changing procurement regulations. And so I want to ask the two of you, if you're okay taking a question from the audience, if you're okay with that. If you've seen or if you think it would work to get sort of in line with this, to have Nederland's procurement regulations that require or measure your providers' contributions back to open source, would that help? Without burdening you, but just one more thing, as you're qualifying a service provider, could that be an additional qualifier to how you select? And would it help?
Okay. I would say yes. So currently what we are doing is that we're working on new cloud and sourcing strategies, and part of that is that we're also trying to influence our procurement departments to change and upgrade their kind of internal rules and guidelines. And we do have quite some guidelines on how we do procurement. Most of it is kind of declared by law, but then we have our own kind of internal policies as well. And what you're seeing is that these kind of guidelines are shifting. So the last couple of years, you see that sustainability has become an important topic. So we have these multi-million-dollar procurement processes where we actually are selecting and having strong discussions with candidates to kind of evaluate how sustainable their solution is. If they are actually contributing to digital autonomy, something that we're now actually working on. But yes, that will work. I mean, because now for a big part of it, I think we're doing the work kind of decentralized and in parallel. So I think all these municipalities are doing the same thing. So having this as more a governmental top-down legislation would work, I think.
If anybody else wanted to come in, but I think that there is a big opportunity around this non-price criteria to include things that are sort of, around open source sustainability, for example. A company is contributing as a good open source citizen or things like that. But I think what is needed is also to actually develop the correct metrics that's a strong word, but need to have some kind of agreement on those things, because of course if you just put in a procurement like a call, you say that the contractor should show that they are that they are contributing to, everybody said yes, and we are great. There needs to be, I think, some sort of development of some kind of, doesn't have to be a license, like in the sense like, but some sort of, you can't just say, or my product in the EU, you can say, okay, my product is bio or whatever, it's we're sustainable farming. All these labels, but are proliferating. in some areas. And I think there is a need, if you start to advocate for including such non-price criteria like open source standing or sustainability or whatever, there needs to also be the work to understand what does that mean, and maybe some kind of third party or independent ranking of not ranking, but like the word, Johan.
I was going to say something else.
Yeah. No, but you see what I mean, because otherwise you will have, this is something that we'll always see in every market. Once something becomes trendy or seen as beneficial, if it's like has to do with energy efficiency, about health or whatever, there becomes this kind of health washing, open washing, whatever. If you see that there's a demand for those beneficial aspects, then everybody will say that that's what they're delivering. But there needs to be then a way to actually say, no, I have some verifiable or some independent credentials in this area. Otherwise, everybody will say it. Now I'm jumping, but Horizon funding landscape is very interesting because, of course, the European Commission obviously has this research funding, and when they start to say that every proposal should also include something, then you'll see everybody scrambling to say, how can I say that we have taken consideration of existing standards, and then or something like this, because the Commission says, yes, we need to, standards are important, and we should, let's ensure that all the funding goes to projects where they have considered this. And of course, every proposal will tick the box and say, yes, we have considered, or we will consider all existing standards. But how do we go from just words, and this is a recurring theme for me in my work, is like really, how do we go from, at some point, having the high-level endorsement, because we don't always have that, but once we get there, how do we ensure that this actually leads to some real change, and not just everybody jumping on the bandwagon, but we don't actually have any result from it?
And this is really tying back to the
I don't know. 5 minutes.
Always the case.
He'll be in the hall.
But this ties back to this ties back to the topic, just as we're talking about now, in how you do procurement, how you qualify vendors. That's a big issue. Numbers can easily be played, and showing the direction, maybe not having like an indicator. Do you have the country has considered open source qualifying requirements for vendors, number of percentage of procurements per year, potential indicator. But what we want with this compass, and together with Omar, Odette, and you is create the framework, the guardrails that can help point the direction and then visualize practices, for example, by the city of Amsterdam, the city of Paris, national governments. So basically drawing up the map, so where countries can report how they are doing business, and then trying to create some kind of pointer, and then creating points of references along this road that people can learn from. And I think that's one of the main things we want to... no, let's skip that.
One of the things that we are, maybe to our research also. No, that's your slide. But, it's just about saying that, our work is around research and, we're not around research, we're researchers. So it's also about making sure that it's the right indicators too. Again, not just saying open or sustainable or whatever, but actually grounding that in research. And so,
you can just add, so we did this study for the Danish Agency of Digital Government, where we did 16 case studies of policy dating back to first open source mention, and also support mechanisms. And you can see, for example, in the Netherlands, the first OSPO was actually in 2003 or something. And then there's a wave occurring with different lawmakers and initiatives, different levels of policy, both inbound in terms of how you acquire open source, when you should do it, but also when and how you release it, and different support mechanisms. And now we're seeing an up curve again due to certain business happening around the world. So, I mean, from these countries, we saw a lot of, like, we saw like a common pointer or a roadmap looking both at policy in terms of how you design policy on national, local, regional levels, supporting open source in the public sector, in governments, but also support mechanisms. So just by looking at these, we found a vast flora of good examples that can be like put out on the map, that together with the compass can help different countries, national governments to like draw their way and look to who they should contact, who they can learn from, and so on. And also laying out a roadmap where they can, okay, we need to mature as a country in terms of how we're leveraging open source in our digital transformation of digital public services. We can look at this set of indicators to slowly mature our way and then learn from others along the way.
James, you had a question? Or comment?
It's sort of question/comments.
Comments are okay.
Yeah, it's sort of connecting the previous discussion about drivers which you could hope for in procurement. And you mentioned DESI was a bit of a frustrating exercise, but the Commission generally doesn't want to call out explicitly one technology over another, even though it knows full well it is a better technology from a public sector perspective than a proprietary one, but at a purely philosophical level. So then, of course, the DESI was succeeded by this digital decade. Again, no real explicit mention. So I think you're absolutely right. We have to not call it open source, but have to describe it. And there is, of course, high hygiene when it comes to interoperability. Also in terms of other telltale signs of what you're going to get when you go open. So I know in the Netherlands, you have this initiative now in Parliament to define what digital sovereignty means. And so looking at how reversibility kicks in, how you have control of your IT system, et cetera, et cetera. So there are lots of ways of describing open source without saying it's got to be open source. I think the other maybe final questions like comment is, the thing I like about the UN is with all of these protectionist tendencies we're seeing at a national level, at a regional level, whether it's in Europe or it's elsewhere, right? There is a real risk that open source is detrimentally impacted by that. And so once you start localizing some kind of production, made in, what have you, you start fragmenting the ecosystem. It's a huge ecosystem, as we can see these surveys. So I guess my point and question back to you guys is, do you see then now the intervention of the UN kind of making that point, that this is a global ecosystem, best ideas come from anywhere, and that should be cherished, and therefore it's more about when you're looking at a procurement perspective, you're looking for vendors or partners who are actually genuinely contributing, high volume, high quality, you can check that, track that, and then reflecting that in terms of your procurement decisions, and making sure that's done in a very non-protectionist, or better way of putting it, in a highly inclusive way. And I think if you do that, then you kind of kill many birds with that one stone. Thank you.
No, James, I agree with you. And we need to, I think that, again, coming back to this non-price criteria, a lot of focus on buying European. I think, this is my personal opinion, I think that just buy European, that's not going to be good for European. It's going to be good maybe for certain European companies, but not even in the long run. I really think this is not... I think, I take digital sovereignty for Europe very seriously. I think it's about understanding, and I think there was a session that I missed, but it's like, how do we, it's about criticality. So what are the actual critical projects, technologies that what are the critical technologies? And do we have skills in those areas? And I would also like to see some research around sort of how many SMEs in Europe are depending on open source. That's a, you know, if anybody has this figure handy, I think it would be really interesting to understand that, you know, a lot of European SMEs are, you know, contributing to and using open source technologies and adapting them to local customers. And this is an important part of what open source can deliver, this customization, and also local jobs and skills. And I think that we don't have this kind of information. I just anecdotally, because I joined the board of Drupal Association last year, and every time, yes, exactly, I saw some face there. Oh, because I go to conferences and then people say, oh, Drupal. It gets the most positive response somehow. Like, and you know, also in the Commission, you ask the Commission, what's a good example of open source used by the European Commission? They say, oh, Drupal, you know, because the European Commission website, you know, websites are based on Drupal, and the European Commission employs a lot of Drupal developers and also have organized, I think, at the European Commission premises, Drupal hackathons and things like that. So they're also contributing, Commission is contributing back to an open source project in that way. What I mean is I'm getting this feedback from people, a lot of SMEs, I find. I'm in Finland or whatever, they're in Spain, a lot of SMEs, but I don't have the number. How many of these SMEs are there in Europe that are using and contributing to open source projects and are, you know, creating jobs in Europe, but also are a kind of store of skills that are critical for digital sovereignty. So, you know,
I
future
think,
research.
Tying back to your point, I mean, that conversation we're having now is very Eurocentric. I mean, of course, we're at the Open Source Summit Europe. So that may come natural, but I think what the UN does is, that it lifts this to the global perspective. The UN talks about global digital public goods, DPGs, the global DPI, the global digital public infrastructure, with how identification is done, how payments are done, how data is exchanged, and there are I believe Drupal is a digital public good.
It is. I'm not here to, you know, but it's just,
I did it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there are a lot of good examples of open source technologies. And again, open source is a tool. And we're talking about open source as a tool for public digital services and public sector digital transformation. And this is really what this is about, and taking a global, non-regional perspective. Yeah, contact us, and if you are somebody who think that you know somebody government that would want to fund this through the UN, contact our UN colleague. This is not something that we are fundraising for in this way, but the UN is looking for governments who want to take a leadership role in this. So. Looking at front runners who want to say that they are funding this effort. Yep. And also if you want to be a knowledge partner in any way and contribute to the work.
Or if you're aware of any existing work, indicators, etc. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.